Roberto Silva sat hunched over on a cold, hard bench, the city lights flickering above him like distant stars mocking his fall from grace. His hands, once wrapped in the finest leather boxing gloves, now clutched a battered plastic cup, rattling with the spare coins tossed his way by passers-by. The streets had become his home, the noise of the city blending into a constant hum in the background of his broken life. Once a champion, now a shadow of the man he used to be. There was a time when Roberto's name filled stadiums. His fists were known to every sports fan across the country, and his rise to fame had been nothing short of meteoric. A kid from the streets who became the undefeated champion in the lightweight division. But all that came crashing down one fateful night. One wrong punch, one snap of his tendons, and it was all over. The doctors said he would never fight again. His body was ruined, but it was the isolation that crushed him. The friends he thought he had quickly disappeared, the endorsements dried up, and his wife left when the money stopped coming in. It all spiraled so fast. Now, years later, Roberto found himself on these same streets, a forgotten relic of a time that no longer seemed real. The few who recognized him didn't stop to say hello. They just stared for a second longer, pity flashing in their eyes before they turned away. Roberto tugged at the old jacket he'd found in a donation bin, pulling it tighter against the night's chill. He looked down at his hands, calloused, scarred, but steady. They hadn't forgotten how to fight, but his body had. His dreams of the ring were long gone, replaced by nightmares of his downfall. He'd once fought for glory, for pride. Now all he fought for was survival. The nights were the hardest. Alone, surrounded by strangers who didn't care if he lived or died, Roberto wondered how it had all come to this. He'd give anything to feel the thrill of the crowd one more time, to step into the ring, even for just one round. But deep down, he knew that part of his life was over, and there was no going back. As he drifted into another restless sleep on the park bench, his mind wandered back to the last fight. The crack of the punch that ended it all echoed in his ears, followed by the ringing silence of the stadium. No cheers, no jeers, just the emptiness of defeat. The memory was always the same, taunting, relentless. And every morning, Roberto would wake up in the same place, the streets, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a fading memory of who he once was. Roberto shuffled through the alleyway, his stomach growling with hunger. He was used to the feeling by now, the constant gnawing that never quite went away. His hands dug through a dumpster, searching for anything worth salvaging. Old food, scrap metal, something he could sell for a few bucks. As he rummaged, the distant hum of the city faded into the background. Then a sound caught his ear, soft but unmistakable. A baby's cry. Roberto froze. He turned toward the noise, barely audible over the rustling of trash. For a moment, he thought he was imagining it, but then it came again, sharper this time, cutting through the silence of the alley. He followed the sound, his eyes scanning the piles of garbage until he spotted it, a small bundle, wrapped in dirty blankets, nestled between two overflowing trash bags. "What the hell?" Roberto muttered under his breath. He approached cautiously, his heart beating faster. Kneeling down, he pulled the blankets back, revealing a tiny face, red from crying. The baby couldn't have been more than a few days old. Its little fists clenched tight, its cries desperate and hungry. Roberto stared, his mind reeling. Who would leave a baby out here, abandoned, forgotten, just like him? For a long moment, he didn't know what to do. His first instinct was to walk away, pretend he hadn't seen it. He had enough problems trying to take care of himself. What could he possibly do for a child? But as he stood there, ready to turn his back, something inside him wouldn't let go. The baby's cries grew weaker, and Roberto couldn't shake the thought that if he left it there, it wouldn't survive the night. His own pain, the bitterness that had consumed him for years, tugged at his heart. "Damn it," he whispered, shaking his head. He reached down, scooping the tiny bundle into his arms. The baby's cries softened as it settled against his chest, its body trembling from the cold. Roberto held it awkwardly, unsure of how to handle something so small, so fragile. He glanced around the alley, half expecting someone to show up and claim the child, But there was no one, only the faint hum of the city in the distance. With a deep sigh, Roberto wrapped the blanket tighter around the baby and started walking. His mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. He didn't have much, a few coins, an old jacket, and a spot under the bridge where he slept. But somehow he couldn't just leave the kid behind. Not like this. As he made his way down the dark street, the weight of the child in his arms felt both foreign and familiar. For the first time in a long time, he felt something stir inside him, a sense of responsibility, of purpose. The streets had taken everything from him, but maybe, just maybe, he could still give something back. Roberto sat beneath the overpass, cradling the baby in his arms. The air was damp and cold, the kind that seeped into your bones and refused to leave. He'd been in worse situations, but never with a baby. The child had finally stopped crying, its tiny face pressed against Roberto's chest, as if finding comfort in the warmth of his body. He glanced down at the baby, its small fist still clenched, its breathing shallow. "What am I supposed to do with you, huh?" he muttered, though he didn't expect an answer. He hadn't taken care of anyone in years, not since his wife had left him. The idea of being responsible for another life terrified him. The first night was rough. Roberto barely slept, too worried that the baby might get too cold or that it might need something he couldn't provide. He wasn't even sure how to feed it. The next morning, he scrounged together the few coins he had and headed to the nearest corner store, hoping to find something, anything that might help. He had no idea what babies ate, so he grabbed a carton of milk and some bread, the cheapest things he could find. Back under the overpass, Roberto did his best. He dipped a corner of the bread in the milk, hoping it would be enough to calm the child's hunger. The baby fussed, crying softly as Roberto awkwardly tried to feed it. After a few attempts, it finally started to take some of the soaked bread, its cries slowing to small whimpers. Roberto let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "There you go," he whispered. "I guess that's good enough, right?" Days passed, and Roberto fell into a routine, if you could call it that. He'd scavenge for food during the day, always keeping the baby close, and at night they'd sleep under the bridge, sharing his old jacket for warmth. It wasn't much of a life, but it was all he had to offer. Each day, Roberto felt the weight of the responsibility growing heavier, but something else grew alongside it. The baby, whom he'd named Lucas after his own father, had started to calm down in his presence. There were moments, brief as they were, when Lucas would look up at him with wide, trusting eyes, and Roberto would feel a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. But doubt still gnawed at him. He wasn't fit to raise a child, especially not on the streets. Every night as he rocked Lucas to sleep, Roberto thought about finding a shelter or a hospital, somewhere he could leave the baby and walk away. It would be easier, less of a burden. But each time he pushed the thought aside. He couldn't abandon Lucas, not after everything. For the first time since his fall from grace, Roberto had a reason to keep going. The streets hadn't broken him completely, and with Lucas in his arms, he felt a fragile but undeniable sense of purpose growing. Years passed, and Lucas grew quickly. By the time he turned 6, he was a bright, energetic kid with a wild curiosity for the world around him. Roberto had done his best to keep Lucas safe and healthy, despite their circumstances. They moved around the city, finding safer places to sleep when the nights grew too cold. Food was always scarce, but somehow, they got by. What Lucas lacked in material comfort, he made up for with his boundless energy and joy. One afternoon, as they wandered through an empty parking lot, Lucas began running in circles around Roberto, laughing as his feet slapped the pavement. His shoes, worn and too small, barely held together, but that didn't slow him down. Roberto watched amused as Lucas darted back and forth, his small frame moving with a surprising speed and agility. "Slow down, kid," Roberto called out, though he couldn't help but smile. Lucas ignored him, picking up speed instead, his legs pumping furiously as he zoomed across the lot. Roberto's smile faded slightly as he watched more closely. There was something about the way Lucas moved, fluid, effortless. It reminded him of the runners he used to train with at the gym, back in the days when he was still fighting. For a 6-year-old kid, Lucas had an incredible natural rhythm. his feet finding their stride almost instinctively. "Lucas!" Roberto called out, his voice more serious now. "Come here for a second." Lucas slowed to a stop, panting and grinning as he jogged back over. "What's up?" "Run across the lot again," Roberto said, pointing to the far side. "As fast as you can." Lucas raised an eyebrow, confused by the sudden request, but did as he was told. He turned, took a deep breath, and bolted across the pavement. Roberto's eyes narrowed as he watched the boy's form, his arms pumping in sync with his legs, his feet barely touching the ground before they shot forward again. By the time Lucas reached the other side, Roberto's heart was pounding. The kid was fast, really fast. "You want me to do it again?" Lucas asked, wiping sweat from his forehead as he trotted back. Roberto nodded, still processing what he'd just seen. "Yeah, one more time," he said, his voice low. "But this time, really go for it. Push yourself." Lucas grinned, always eager for a challenge. He turned and sprinted back across the lot, his feet moving even faster than before. Roberto could feel the stirrings of something inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. He watched as Lucas crossed the finish line he'd imagined in his head, and in that moment, a flood of memories washed over him. He remembered his own days of training, the grueling hours spent building speed, stamina, and strength, the drills, the conditioning, the endless running. It had been years since he'd stepped into a gym or felt the thrill of competition, but watching Lucas move, he felt that old fire begin to spark again. When Lucas came back, breathing hard but smiling, Roberto placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're fast, kid," he said, his voice filled with both surprise and admiration. "Real fast." Lucas beamed, his chest swelling with pride. "Yeah? You think so?" Roberto nodded, his mind already spinning with possibilities. Lucas had a gift, something natural, something rare. He didn't just run, he flew. And in that moment, Roberto saw a chance not just for Lucas, but for himself. Training Lucas could be his way back, not to the ring, but to something even more important. He could make Lucas a champion, maybe even something more than Roberto had ever been. "I think," Roberto said slowly, crouching down to Lucas's level, "that we've got some work to do." Lucas blinked. "Work? What do you mean?" Roberto smiled, that old familiar determination beginning to creep back into his bones. "I mean, we're gonna train. I'm gonna make you faster, stronger, better than anyone else out there." Lucas's eyes widened with excitement, but a flicker of doubt crossed his face. "But we don't have anything. No equipment, no gym." Roberto laughed, a sound that felt strange after so long. "We don't need all that fancy stuff. We've got the streets. That's enough." Lucas grinned, and in that moment, Roberto knew he'd found his purpose again. This kid was his second chance, not just at redemption, but at life. The streets had taken everything from him, but now with Lucas, he had something to fight for again. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Roberto was serious about training Lucas, and the boy, excited by the challenge, took to it with enthusiasm. They had no fancy equipment, no proper track or gym, but Roberto was resourceful. The city itself became their training ground. Sidewalks became their track, traffic cones and garbage bins their hurdles, and the staircases of abandoned buildings their conditioning tools. "Speed's only part of it," Roberto said one morning as they stood at the edge of a long, empty street. "You gotta be strong too. You have to last, even when you're tired." Lucas nodded, bouncing on his toes, eager to start. His energy was endless, a sharp contrast to the tiredness that often weighed on Roberto's bones. But for the first time in years, Roberto felt alive again. He had a purpose, a mission. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was working towards something. And Lucas, with his boundless enthusiasm and natural talent, gave him hope. The training wasn't easy. Roberto pushed Lucas hard, maybe harder than he should have. But he knew what it took to be great. They'd run sprints up and down the streets for hours. When Lucas's legs started to shake, Roberto made him run one more. When he thought he couldn't go any further, Roberto reminded him that champions didn't quit just because they were tired. Lucas would grumble and groan, but he never gave up. They trained wherever they could, often attracting curious looks from passers-by. People would pause, watching the odd pair, an old, weathered man coaching a scrappy young boy on the side of the road. Some laughed, shaking their heads as if to say, "What's the point?" Others whispered, calling Roberto crazy, but he didn't care. He ignored them, focusing only on Lucas and the task at hand. One afternoon, after a grueling session of hill sprints, Lucas collapsed onto the sidewalk, panting heavily. His shirt was drenched in sweat, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. "That's it," Roberto said, standing over him. "That's what it takes. You want to be the best? You got to push harder than anyone else." Lucas looked up at him, his face flushed but smiling. "I want to be the best," he breathed. Roberto smiled back, a rare softness in his eyes. "Good. Because you've got what it takes, kid." It wasn't just the physical training that mattered, though. Roberto knew that to survive, especially coming from where they were, Lucas needed to be mentally tough. Life on the streets had taught Roberto that the world didn't care about your excuses or your struggles. You either fought through it or you got left behind. "Remember," Roberto told him after another long run, "no one's going to give you anything. Not out here, not in life. You want something, you have to take it." Lucas nodded, soaking in every word. He admired Roberto, saw him as more than just a trainer. He was a father figure, the only family Lucas had ever really known. He wanted to make Roberto proud, and every day he pushed himself harder, running faster, jumping higher, just to see that flicker of pride in Roberto's eyes. But it wasn't without challenges. The streets were unforgiving. There were days when food was scarce, when the weather was too cold or too wet to train. Roberto would wake up stiff and sore, his body reminding him that he wasn't young anymore. But still, they pressed on. They had to. There were other dangers too. The people who lived on the streets alongside them weren't always friendly. There were gangs, thieves, and addicts. Roberto kept Lucas close, always watching, always on guard. He couldn't afford to lose focus, not for a second. One evening, as they sat together under the overpass that had become their makeshift home, Lucas asked a question that had been on his mind for a while. Do you think I could really be a champion one day?" Roberto turned to look at him, his face serious. "I know you can, but it's going to take more than just running fast. You have to want it more than anything else. You have to be willing to give everything for it." Lucas nodded, his eyes wide with determination. "I'm ready." Roberto felt a surge of pride and a flicker of something deeper, hope. For the first time in years, he believed in something again. Lucas was his chance at redemption, a way to prove that even after everything had been taken from him, he still had something left to give. And maybe, just maybe, Lucas could become something even greater than Roberto ever was. As Lucas's training continued, word began to spread. In the neighborhoods where they trained, people started to take notice of the boy with lightning-fast feet and the scrappy old man coaching him. It wasn't long before others began to whisper, "That's Roberto Silva," some said, recognizing the fallen champion. "Did you hear? He's training a kid now. Thinks he's going to make him a star." At first, Roberto brushed it off. People had always talked, especially when you came from nothing like he and Lucas did. But as Lucas grew stronger, faster, more confident, the attention started to grow. Local street races became Lucas's proving ground. It was nothing official, just groups of kids showing off their speed, but Lucas quickly became the one to beat. One afternoon, after a particularly dominant race where Lucas left the other boys trailing far behind, a man approached them. He wore a sharp suit and polished shoes, standing out in stark contrast to the worn-down surroundings. His smile was wide, but something about it didn't sit right with Roberto. "Impressive," the man said, clapping slowly as Lucas wiped the sweat from his forehead. "You've got some serious talent, kid." Lucas glanced at Roberto, unsure how to respond, but Roberto stepped forward, his body tense. "What do you want?" The man raised his hands in a mock surrender, still smiling. "Easy there, champ. I'm just here to talk." He paused, looking Lucas over carefully before turning his gaze back to Roberto. "I'm Lionel Costa. Heard some things about you and the boy here. Thought I'd come see for myself." Roberto's jaw tightened. Lionel Costa was a name he hadn't heard in years, but it brought back memories he'd rather forget. Costa was a businessman now, but back in the day, he'd been involved with the wrong people. Promoters, gamblers, men who made their money off the backs of fighters like Roberto. They'd controlled the ring, and when Roberto had refused to play by their rules, they'd made sure his career ended in ruins. "I don't know what you think you're doing here, Costa," Roberto said, his voice low and sharp, "but we're not interested." Costa chuckled, undeterred. "Come on, Silva, don't be like that. I see something in the boy. I could help him, you know. Get him into real competitions, introduce him to the right people. You know how this works? Talent like his needs connections." Roberto's eyes narrowed. "We don't need your help." Costa's smile faded slightly, his expression hardening. "You really think you can take this kid all the way on your own? Look at you, Silva. You're living under a bridge, training on the streets. That's not how champions are made." Roberto stepped closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "Get out of here, Costa. We don't need anything from you." For a moment, Costa just stared at him, his eyes cold and calculating. Then with a sigh, he straightened his jacket and took a step back. "All right, Silva, have it your way. But remember this, the world doesn't care about talent without money. If you want that kid to have a shot, you'll come to me. Sooner or later, you'll realize you don't have a choice." With that, Costa turned and walked away, leaving Roberto seething. Lucas, who had been quiet throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "Who was that guy?" Roberto shook his head, his anger still simmering. "No one you need to worry about. Just stay focused. We've got work to do." But Costa's words lingered. The truth was, as much as Roberto hated to admit it, they didn't have the resources to take Lucas to the next level. No equipment, no proper coaching facilities, no sponsorships. The world of professional sports was unforgiving, and Roberto knew better than anyone that talent alone wouldn't be enough. Still, he wasn't about to sell Lucas's future to a man like Costa. He'd made that mistake once, and it had cost him everything. He wouldn't let the same thing happen to Lucas. But deep down, Roberto couldn't shake the feeling that Costa wasn't done with them yet. Weeks passed, and Lucas kept training with the same relentless energy he'd shown from the beginning. Every sprint, every drill, he pushed himself harder. Roberto could see the fire in his eyes, the same fire he'd once had when he was young. Lucas was hungry, and the streets had toughened him in ways no gym ever could. But the world outside their little bubble was creeping closer, and Roberto knew they couldn't stay in the shadows forever. One afternoon, after another street race, something unexpected happened. A man in a tracksuit approached them, this time without the air of slimy business deals. He had a clipboard in his hand and a whistle hanging around his neck, looking more like a coach than a hustler. His name was Carlos Mendez, and he ran a local youth athletics club. "I've been watching your kid for a while now," Carlos said, nodding toward Lucas, who was catching his breath after another easy win. "He's fast, real fast." Roberto, always suspicious of anyone who showed interest in Lucas, narrowed his eyes. "Yeah? And what do you want?" Carlos held up his hands. "Nothing shady, if that's what you're thinking. I'm not looking to sign him or anything. I run the neighborhood track club, and I'm putting together a team for the regional championships. It's legit, I promise." Roberto glanced at Lucas, who was staring up at Carlos with wide, eager eyes. He knew the kid wanted this, an actual competition, a chance to prove himself. But Roberto had seen too many broken promises, too many people with hidden agendas. He wasn't about to let Lucas get swept up in something that could hurt him. "I don't know," Roberto said slowly. "We're doing fine on our own." "Look, I get it," Carlos said. "You've been taking care of him, getting him this far, but he's got real talent, and this is his shot at getting noticed by people who can help him go even further. The regionals are no joke. If he wins, scouts are going to take notice. It could open doors for him." Roberto stayed silent for a long moment, weighing his options. Lucas had worked hard, harder than any kid his age should have to. He deserved a shot at something bigger, something real. But part of Roberto feared what would come after. Once Lucas stepped into that world, there would be no turning back. "Okay," Roberto said finally, his voice steady. "We'll give it a shot, but I'm not letting him go alone. I'll be there, watching every step." Carlos smiled, clearly relieved. "Of course. You're his coach after all." The next few weeks flew by in a blur of intense preparation. Lucas trained harder than ever, knowing that the regionals could change everything. Roberto pushed him to his limits but always kept an eye on his health, making sure he didn't burn out. It was a delicate balance, especially with their limited resources. They didn't have the luxury of proper training facilities, just the same old streets and the worn-down sneakers Lucas had outgrown months ago. On the day of the regional championships, the stadium was packed. For a kid who had only ever raced on empty streets, the sight of the cheering crowds and the neatly lined track was overwhelming. Roberto could see the nervous energy radiating off Lucas as they stood at the edge of the field, watching the other competitors warm up. "Hey," Roberto said, crouching down to Lucas's level. "You've got this, all right? You've trained harder than anyone here. You're ready." Lucas nodded, though his eyes still flickered with doubt. "What if I mess up?" "You won't," Roberto said firmly. "But even if something goes wrong, you just get back up and keep going. That's what we do, right? We don't quit." Lucas took a deep breath and nodded again, more confidently this time. "Right." As Lucas lined up at the starting blocks, Roberto felt a wave of emotion he hadn't expected. He'd trained fighters before, seen them step into the ring, but this was different. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about Lucas, about giving the kid the chance he deserved. Watching him stand there, ready to race, Roberto felt a swell of pride that took him by surprise. The gun went off, and Lucas shot forward, his body moving with the same fluid speed Roberto had seen in those first races on the street. He was fast, faster than anyone else on the track. But this time, the competition was tougher. The other boys were bigger, more experienced, and Lucas had to fight for every inch of ground. Roberto's heart pounded as he watched from the sidelines, his eyes glued to Lucas. The boy pushed harder, his legs pumping like pistons as he surged ahead, inching closer to the lead. For a moment, Roberto thought he might not make it. But then, in the final stretch, Lucas found another gear. He dug deep, sprinting past the competition and crossing the finish line in first place. The crowd erupted in cheers, but all Roberto could see was Lucas, standing there breathless and wide-eyed, trying to process what had just happened. He'd done it. Lucas was a champion. The victory was a whirlwind. Lucas had crossed the finish line as the fastest in the regional championships, and for the first time in his life, he was standing under the spotlight. The crowd was cheering, officials were shaking his hand, and other kids from the competition looked at him with a mix of admiration and envy. But Lucas's eyes weren't on any of them. They searched the stands until he found Roberto, standing off to the side, a proud but guarded smile on his face. Roberto raised his hand in a simple gesture, his version of a congratulation. He was proud, no doubt about that. Lucas had done something incredible, something that could change his life. But there was also a knot of worry tightening in Roberto's gut. This win, while a huge step, was also the start of something much bigger and much more dangerous. As Lucas came bounding toward him full of excitement, Roberto couldn't help but think of all the vultures that would soon come circling. He'd seen it all before. The promises, the contracts, the whispers of glory. They'd take someone like Lucas, chew him up, and spit him out. "You did it, kid," Roberto said, patting Lucas on the back as they left the track. "You ran a hell of a race." Lucas beamed, still riding the high of his victory. "I couldn't have done it without you, Roberto." Before Roberto could respond, a figure stepped into their path. It was Lionel Costa, the businessman who had approached them weeks earlier. His slick grin was back, and this time he wasn't alone. Two men in suits flanked him, all with the polished confidence of people used to getting what they wanted. "Well, well," Costa said, clapping slowly. "I knew the kid had potential, but that was something else. Congratulations, Lucas." Lucas blinked, caught off guard by the sudden attention. Thanks?" Roberto's face hardened. "What do you want, Costa?" Costa ignored Roberto's tone, his eyes fixed on Lucas. "I told you I could help, didn't I? And here we are. The kid's already a champion. But this is just the beginning." With the right backing, the right opportunities, Lucas could go all the way to nationals, even the world stage. Roberto stepped between Costa and Lucas, his voice low and dangerous. "We don't need you, Costa. Back off." Costa sighed as if tired of playing games. "Roberto, I get that you're trying to protect him, but you know how this works. Talent like his, it doesn't stay hidden for long. Whether you like it or not, people are going to come knocking, and not all of them will play nice." He paused, glancing meaningfully at Lucas. "You want the best for him, right? A real shot? Let me make some calls. Put him in front of the right people." Lucas looked at Roberto, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. He was young, but he wasn't stupid. He knew what this could mean. Sponsorships, real training facilities, maybe even the chance to leave the streets behind. Roberto saw it too, but he knew the cost that came with deals like these. He'd made one a long time ago, and it had destroyed him. "I said no," Roberto repeated, his jaw tight. "We're not doing this your way." Costa's smile faded, his eyes turning cold. "You think you can keep him hidden forever? You think no one else will come for him? Sooner or later, you're going to have to make a choice, Roberto. Don't let your pride ruin his chance." With that, Costa and his men turned and walked away, leaving a heavy silence behind them. Roberto stood still for a long moment, his fists clenched at his sides, fighting the urge to chase Costa down. He hated that man more than words could express, but he also knew Costa was right about one thing. This win had put Lucas on the map, and people would come knocking. Lucas shifted uneasily beside him. "Do you think maybe we should have listened to him?" Roberto sighed, his shoulders slumping as the adrenaline from the race wore off. "Look, kid, I know what it sounds like. A chance to get out of this, to be something more. But I've seen guys like Costa before. They don't care about you, not really. They'll use you up, then toss you aside when you're no longer useful." Lucas stared at the ground, his earlier excitement fading. "But what if he's right? What if this is my only shot?" Roberto knelt down in front of him, his voice softening. "You've got talent, Lucas, real talent. And with or without guys like him, you're going places. But we do this on our terms, all right? No shortcuts, no selling out. You've earned everything you've got so far, and that's how it's going to stay." Lucas looked up at him, his eyes filled with both trust and doubt. "Okay, I trust you." Roberto nodded, though the weight of the decision still hung heavy over them. He knew what they were up against. The win had opened doors, but it had also painted a target on Lucas's back. And the hardest part was knowing that sooner or later, they might not have a choice but to face it head on. The days following Lucas's victory were a strange mix of excitement and tension. Word spread fast about the boy who had won the regional championships, and people were starting to take notice. Lucas was invited to join more races, this time in proper stadiums with real competition. For the first time, there were opportunities to win real prizes, money, scholarships, even sponsorships. But Roberto remained wary, always keeping a close eye on who was approaching them and what they wanted. It wasn't long before Lionel Costa came knocking again, this time with more aggressive tactics. Legal documents began to show up, and Roberto received a summons to court. The charge? Lionel Costa was claiming parental rights over Lucas. Roberto's heart sank when he read the papers. They laid it out in cold, unforgiving legal terms. Lionel Costa was Lucas's biological father, and he was demanding custody. Roberto had known from the start that Lucas's origins were a mystery, but this was something he hadn't expected. He'd always feared someone would come for the boy, but he never thought it would be Costa. Sitting with the papers in his hands, Roberto felt the weight of it all bearing down on him. He looked over at Lucas, who was practicing sprints on the sidewalk, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing. The next few days were a blur of legal battles and sleepless nights. Roberto found a volunteer lawyer willing to help, but they both knew the truth. The system wasn't on their side. Lionel Costa had money, power, and influence, all things Roberto lacked. As much as it pained him, Roberto knew this was a fight he couldn't win by sheer will alone. The court hearing arrived faster than Roberto could have prepared for. He sat beside Lucas, feeling out of place, in a room filled with people in expensive suits and polished shoes. Across the room, Costa sat confidently, his lawyers flanking him like guards protecting their king. Roberto felt his stomach churn, knowing what was at stake. The hearing itself was brutal. Costa's legal team painted Roberto as an irresponsible, homeless man who had no business raising a child, especially one with as much potential as Lucas. They presented documentation, witnesses, even photos of the places where Roberto and Lucas had slept over the years. Roberto tried to defend himself, to explain the bond he had with Lucas, but his words felt small in the face of Costa's overwhelming power. Then came the bombshell. Costa's lawyers revealed the truth. Costa had known about Lucas since birth. He had pulled strings to have the child abandoned in the very neighborhood Roberto lived in, ensuring that Lucas would grow up under difficult circumstances. Costa's twisted plan was to later swoop in, rescue Lucas, and mold him into the athlete he wanted, under Costa's control. Roberto was stunned. The revelation hit him like a punch to the gut. Lucas wasn't just some abandoned kid he had found by chance. He had been part of Costa's sick game all along. The betrayal stung, but what hurt most was the realization that, despite everything, Lucas was still vulnerable to this man's manipulation. Lucas sat silently beside Roberto as the court heard the evidence. His young face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief, as the truth about his past unfolded before him. He glanced at Roberto, searching for some kind of explanation, but there was nothing Roberto could say to soften the blow. The judge adjourned the hearing for a decision, but Roberto knew the fight was far from over. As they left the courthouse, Lucas finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is it true?" he asked. "Was I just part of his plan?" Roberto stopped, turning to face the boy. His heart ached seeing the confusion and hurt in Lucas's eyes. "I didn't know, kid. I didn't know any of this. But you're not some pawn in his game. You're more than that. We're more than that." Lucas swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "I don't want to be with him, Roberto. I don't care if he's my real dad. I don't care about any of that." Roberto placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we fight, Lucas. No matter what happens, we fight." The final decision from the court came a few weeks later, and it was a bitter pill to swallow. The judge ruled that Lionel Costa, as Lucas's biological father, had the right to shared custody. Roberto would be allowed to remain in Lucas's life as his guardian and coach, but Costa now had a legal say in where Lucas lived and how his career developed. It wasn't the outcome Roberto had hoped for, but it wasn't a complete loss either. Lucas took the news in stride, but Roberto could see the pain behind his brave face. The boy didn't want anything to do with Costa, and Roberto knew that whatever happened next, they would need to be careful. Costa's influence was a powerful force, and Roberto feared that the man would use every opportunity to pull Lucas further into his world of manipulation. But despite the legal battle and the looming threat of Costa, Roberto and Lucas pressed on. Training continued, just like it always had. On the streets, with nothing but their determination to keep them going. The races kept coming and Lucas kept winning. He was getting noticed now, not just in their city, but across the region. Scouts were watching, and the whispers of scholarships and sponsorships were growing louder. Through it all, Roberto stood by Lucas's side, guiding him, pushing him, and reminding him of the lessons they'd learned on the streets. No matter what opportunities came their way, they agreed on one thing: they would do it on their terms. No shortcuts, no selling out. Everything they earned would be through hard work and integrity. One evening, after another long day of training, Lucas sat beside Roberto on the old park bench where their journey had truly begun. The city lights flickered in the distance, and the air was thick with the sounds of traffic and life moving on around them. "You know," Lucas said, staring out at the city, "I used to think that winning would be the most important thing. But now, I just want to make you proud." Roberto turned to him, his heart swelling with pride and emotion. "Kid, you've already made me proud. It's not about the races or the trophies or any of that. It's about who you've become. You're stronger than anyone I've ever known, and that's what matters." Lucas smiled, his shoulders relaxing a little as the weight of the world seemed to lift. if only for a moment. I wouldn't have made it this far without you. Roberto shook his head. No, Lucas, you got here because you worked for it. I just gave you a little push. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the world pass by. Roberto couldn't help but feel a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Lucas was on his way to greatness, but more importantly, the boy had become more than Roberto ever dreamed he could be. In that quiet moment, Roberto realized something. His own life, once broken and beaten by the harshness of the streets, had found a new purpose in Lucas. The redemption he had sought for so long hadn't come from winning back his old glory. It had come from helping Lucas find his. As they stood up to leave, Roberto looked at Lucas, the young champion who had once been just a helpless child, abandoned in the trash. Together they had faced every obstacle, and together they would face whatever came next. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were fighters, and they were ready for whatever the world had in store.